Hello and welcome everybody, thank you for watching. Disclaimer first, I spent the entire day translating Japanese invoices, so I'm not really in the mood to try hard and get everything perfect in this video. I'll just record it once, and if there are any mistakes, I'm going to point it out in the description or in the comments, okay? So this video is going to be about the question whether you should build frigates or submarines on the T1 Navy stage. And since Navy seems a little complex, many beginners struggle with this. But this video is going to provide some help at answering this question. And let us not waste any time and get started. So when you're new to naval gameplay, it is probably the easiest to compare it with air, right? So if you watched the naval tutorial I made earlier with the tips for naval gameplay, then you know that the cost structure of Navy is comparable to land, but the behavior of naval units is comparable to air. So basically your submarine is a unit that is going to kill naval targets, and the frigate is going to be a unit that kills surface targets, right? So it can shoot at other ships, but it cannot shoot at anything underwater, right? So you could say that a submarine to some extent is a bit like an interceptor, and a frigate is a bit like a bomber, because bombers can target engineers, mass extractors, power generators and stuff, right? And submarines aren't really designed to do that, just like fighters aren't designed to shoot at ground targets, right? So this is hopefully helpful, and there's just one difference, right? So basically, as soon as an interceptor is shooting at a bomber, the bomber is going to die, right? Bombers in this game aren't tanky at all, and they die instantly. But for T1 Navy, the situation is different. So frigates are actually very tanky, and submarines have quite low DPS. So when you want to use a submarine to kill a frigate, it is going to take a long time, and you have to intercept it very early. So it's not enough to spot it on your T1 radar and send the submarine and expect the frigate to die before it deals any damage. You have to spot it way earlier than that, right? So this is the difference between air and Navy. So some similarity, but the tankiness and the DPS of those units is different, right? So let's move on to 2, raidability. Well, raidability doesn't exist, I made up this word, but basically what I'm trying to say is some maps have exposed shore mixes, or for land gameplay would be some other kind of exposed raidable expansions. And as soon as you can raid something easily with a frigate, then you should build frigates, right? On a map where you have shore mixes that can be taken out by frigates, and the frigate can probably also shoot at these mixes if you place it carefully. At least this one should target it with a frigate. Then it's just stupid not to have frigates, right? So of course, when you can kill like a high percentage of the enemy eco with frigates, you should build frigates. And only building subs is not going to work. So rather build more frigates on maps which allow you to raid corner mixes, right? So let's move on to map size and intel. Those two interact. So this map is fairly large. If you play 1 versus 1, one player starts here, the other player starts here. And basically the rule is, on a large map, if you have good intel, then submarines are going to be great for defense. Because if the opponent builds frigates, and you have some scouts to, scout the entire map all the time, then the enemy frigates will be spotted, and your submarines can kill them before they arrive, right? And in the other situation, when the map is large and the opponent has bad intel, this is usually a sign that you can use frigates. Because even if the opponent has own frigates and submarines, your frigates will deal damage because he doesn't scout them before they arrive, right? And they can at least kill a few mixes and engineers. So on large maps where your opponent has bad intel, rather build frigates, okay? And do not build submarines when you have bad intel, like you don't scout at all. Well, submarines won't help then, because if you start using the submarine when the enemy frigate is already at your naval factory killing your engineers, it's too late, right? Factor 4 would be enemy engineers. I have two situations here. One would be some heavily assisted naval factories. This is something you would rather raid with frigates than submarines. And if you can tell that the opponent has a couple of land factories at the shore and they're streaming engineers towards those factories, then it's better to attack with frigates instead of submarines, because those engineers can actually build a torpedo tower quite quickly if they have to. And torpedo towers are very good against submarines, but frigates can actually tank some of the fire and kill more engineers. But for submarines, they just die instantly against the torp tower, and the low DPS is going to make it difficult for them to damage anything. Like the submarine DPS is low, right? So do not raid bases with many engineers with submarines, and plan your composition accordingly when you see something like that. But stuff where maybe the opponent has some frigates, maybe they're just being finished, and there are few submarines, few factories, pardon, and less engineers. This is something you could raid with submarines, right? Because those engineers are probably not going to finish a torpedo tower in time. Okay, so it would make sense to raid this with submarines, as you can kill the enemy navy and nothing will shoot back at you, right? A factor 5 would be a faction. So the units are actually different, right? I don't have a naval unit comparison chart yet, but I'm going to make one. So some short introduction for now. Basically, the Aeon frigate is a little worse than the frigates of other factions. The idea is pretty much that the Aeon frigate has slightly higher range, but less HP and DPS. Very similar to the Aurora, like with the range thing. But in naval gameplay, this little bit of extra range doesn't actually matter, because the frigate has a very sluggish turn rate, and the gun cannot shoot everywhere, right? So the orientation of the frigate actually matters. If one of those guns is pointing at the bridge, then it's obviously not going to shoot, right? So kiting with frigates is kind of difficult, especially because the range difference is not so high. So the Aeon frigate is just not as good as other ships, because this range bonus doesn't matter, and it is worse in other ways. And for Cybran, well, Cybran just has the best frigate in the game. They have a very good fire cycle, they don't have a major HP disadvantage, and the anti-air is actually good. Plus, they have the highest DPS. So Cybran should probably go for a more frigate-heavy navy, if you just take a look at the units. Seraphim is strange, I guess. Seraphim has a very weird submarine. It has a torpedo defense, but that doesn't really shoot a lot. Maybe once every 10 seconds or something like that, so you can almost ignore it. But this submarine, well, it has less HP than the submarines of other factions. That makes it worse, but it has a deck laser. I'll talk more about the deck laser later. I guess Cybran and UEF have the deck laser too, but this is kind of the oddball. I'll tell you why in a bit. But this is worse than other submarines, so Seraphim should probably be a bit more frigate heavy when you just take a look at the units. And for UEF it doesn't matter. The submarine for UEF is the same as the other factions, except Seraphim of course. And it has high HP, same DPS. Frigate has high HP and a similar DPS as other factions. Fire cycle maybe not as good, but it is still a good frigate. So UEF is the one that has no obvious disadvantage or obvious advantage between those units. So point 6, faction interaction. So basically you have two types of factions and you have Seraphim. Seraphim is kind of, you know, just Seraphim. So let's start here. The submarines have a deck laser, okay? So this has a deck laser and this has a deck laser. You can see this red stuff and the blue stuff, right? That's a deck laser. And a deck laser is great because some engineers are going to hover, right? So these engineers hover, you can see that, right? They float above the water. So torpedoes are not going to hit them. And that's why UEF and Cybran have to surface their submarines to use the deck laser against enemy engineers. And then these engineers can be taken out by those submarines, right? And in exchange for this bonus, the UEF and Cybran engineer do not hover. So they actually swim on the water, and they have direct water contact, which is why torpedoes can hit them, just like torpedoes would hit actual ships, right? So basically, their engineers are a bit easier to kill, but in exchange, their submarines have more options for killing engineers. This is the deal. And Aeon and Seraphim have those hover engineers, as I said, and for Aeon this is actually quite obvious, right? So Aeon gets their hover engineer at the cost of having a submarine without a deck laser. You can see this is firing torpedoes, but it does not have a deck laser, right? So if you play with Aeon against Seraphim or Aeon, then your submarine will not be able to kill engineers. Something worth noting, right? And, well, Seraphim is strange. Seraphim is a submarine that should not have a deck laser because their engineer is floating, but it has a deck laser, right? You can see it is shooting. And why is this strange? Well, because you could see how this would be an unfair advantage pretty much in this balance consideration. But the HP of the Seraphim submarine is so low that it is kind of not good, right? So this has 525, this has 600, this has 550, and this is just way lower at 400, right? So Seraphim submarine kind of bad. In terms of functionality, it's good, but in terms of actual performance due to the HP, it's bad. All right, so this is kind of the oddball, but you want to consider like the factor whether you could shoot at enemy engineers with your submarine, and whether the enemy engineers can, whether the enemy submarine can shoot at your engineers, right? This is something you want to watch out for. And let's move on to tech. So basically frigates stay viable for the entire game and submarines become useless after a while. T1 submarines, that is, right? So basically the way it works is every faction has a dedicated T2 submarine counter, and for Aeon this is the Exodus class. This is not firing torpedoes, this is firing some I think it's called depth charges, some shells that cannot be stopped by torpedo defense, and those are super strong. So this is actually a kind of like underwater weapon based unit, even though it also has a deck weapon. So this is a very good answer to T1 submarines, and this is something you always build, so submarines aren't a problem anymore as soon as you are on T2. And UEF has Coopers. Coopers are very fast, and they have great micro capabilities. Their range is very high, they have good torpedo defense, and they also have offensive torpedo. So this unit counters submarines. And with some shield boats, you can pretty much forget that submarines exist. Now, Cybran, I would say the Cybran destroyer is good enough against submarines on its own, and because it's torpedo based. Very much torpedo based at least, even though it also has a deck weapon. But Cybran has some handy extra tool, which is the Mermaid, the counterintelligence boat, the stealth boat, right? And you can see this reads torpedo defense, and this thing is actually not lying. The torpedo defense of the Mermaid is great, so you should combine it with the destroyer for ideal results against submarines. And Seraphim is a bit more straightforward. They just have a multi-purpose destroyer, which can be submerged. So if the enemy is using some non-torpedo based navy, you submerge it and it deals damage. And against submarines and the like, you can use the deck weapons and the underwater weapons at the same time, so that you can distribute the fire across submarines and other enemy ships, right? And of course they're going to be T2 torpedo bombers. T1 torpedo towers are very good at defending against submarines, I said so already. and you can pretty much ground fire any weapon that has a little bit of area damage, and it is going to kill submarines easily. So this is why T1 submarines become useless after a while. But frigates are different, because frigates have a good HP per mass ratio, and their weapons aren't actually bad, so you can use them throughout the entire naval game. Even if you are in the late T3 stage or T4 stage, you usually still build frigates, because this is just how Navy works. And just keep adding naval factories on T1, which spam frigates, and you have a few higher level factories that build your more valuable ships, right? But the frigates stay your pawns throughout the entire chess game, pretty much, and you need them. So let's move on to the summary. Well, I say if you do not have a specific plan on how to use a very sub-heavy navy, you should probably build more frigates and less submarines for general purpose games or plans, right? And well, maybe something that beginners may care about, if the idea that enemy submarines can shoot at your frigates while your frigates cannot shoot back at the submarines scares you, it probably means that you haven't been building frigates with the intention to raid, because frigates are raid units primarily, right? So you want to use them offensively, and if you build frigates but do not raid, well, you may as well not have any frigates. And the only explanation why a submarine can kill your frigate before it raided anything is that you didn't use it to raid anything, right? So make sure to build frigates when you can raid something, like mixes or engineers, and make sure to actually do so and not just let it stand around. Okay. And well, if that doesn't convince you, then I guess a good reason why you lose to T1 submarines when you have more T1 frigates in your navy and less submarines yourself is probably because you are not using these high-tech options to counter submarines. So usually countering submarines is very easy, and building like torpedo launcher is always an option, right? So it's pretty difficult to lose against submarines, but on the other hand, I have seen some people making good use of submarines too. Bloodier is a huge submarine fan, for example. He almost always opens with submarines, doesn't matter what faction he plays, even if he plays Seraphim, and he's good at using it. So the message is kind of submarines aren't useless, you just need to know what to use them for and how they work. So taking a look at these factors is going to make sense, and of course whatever you build you have to use it right away, right? So I hope this video didn't make you think that submarines are useless. I just hope that you understood that you need some kind of plan if you want to use submarines instead of a frigate-heavy navy. And I hope you got some idea now of what submarines can do and how to actually use them. So thank you very much, and good luck, have fun in your games.